The day I regained my sight. And found my husband in bed with our maid, so I planned the perfect revenge. I was 30 years old when the doctors told me my eyesight could be restored. For years, I had lived in a blurred world, relying on sound, touch, and memory more than sight. At first, blindness had been unbearable, like being locked in a dark room where everyone else had the key. Over time, I adjusted. I learned to measure spaces with my steps, to recognize people by the warmth of their voices, to picture faces from faint outlines and descriptions. Still, inside me, there was always a hunger to see again, to wake up one day and look at the world without struggling. My husband, Daniel, had been by my side since the accident that stole my sight. He was patient, attentive, and always reminded me how beautiful I was. At least, that's what I thought. He worked long hours as an accountant, and while I stayed home, he hired a maid, Maria, to help me with the house. Maria was in her 20s, cheerful, and always humming when she worked. I trusted her. She became like another set of eyes for me, guiding me through crowded rooms, describing colors when I asked, making me laugh when the weight of blindness pressed too hard. The surgery date came sooner than I expected. My hands trembled when I signed the consent forms. Daniel squeezed my hand, whispering promises about the life we would live when I could see again. He painted pictures with words, trips to the beach where I'd watch the waves, dinners where I'd look across the table at his smile, moments where the world would feel new. I clung to those promises like a child clutching a blanket in the dark. The day my bandages were removed, I was terrified. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. When the doctor peeled away the gauze, light stabbed my eyes, and I gasped. At first, everything was overwhelming, shapes melting into one another, colors bleeding, like water on a canvas. Slowly, painfully, the blur sharpened. The doctor's face came into focus, kind eyes behind his glasses. Tears ran down my cheeks, not because of pain, but because I could see again. Daniel was waiting for me outside the clinic. For the first time in years, I saw his face. He looked older than I remembered, lines on his forehead, a tiredness in his eyes, but he smiled, and for a brief moment, my heart leapt. He kissed my forehead and whispered, "Welcome back." The following days were a storm of emotions. I spent hours staring at the simplest things, the steam curling from a cup of tea, the way sunlight painted shadows across the floor, the tiny freckles on my arms I'd forgotten about. I cried when I saw my reflection in the mirror. I was older, changed, but I was me. And I could finally see the world again. But with sight came truths I hadn't expected. Daniel became strangely distant. At first, I thought he was just overwhelmed. He often worked late, sometimes claiming to sleep in the guest room after long nights. I brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. After all, hadn't he been my rock through everything? He wouldn't betray me. Not Daniel. Then there was Maria. She seemed nervous around me, her eyes darting away when I looked at her. I thought maybe she was uncomfortable now that I no longer depended on her so completely. But sometimes, I caught her glancing at Daniel in a way I couldn't ignore. It was subtle, fleeting, but it stirred something in me. A whisper of doubt. I tried to silence it. I wanted to believe my life was perfect now, that I had been given back everything I had lost. But shadows were creeping into my vision, not from my eyes, but from my heart. One evening, Daniel told me he had to work late again. I nodded, kissed him goodbye, and tried to convince myself not to worry. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. I couldn't sleep. Something inside me burned, telling me to open my eyes not just to the world, but to the truth. I walked through the quiet house, my steps soft on the wooden floor. The guest room door was closed, a faint light glowing beneath it. My stomach tightened. I reached for the handle, hesitating. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but my hand moved anyway. The door creaked open. And there it was, the sight that shattered me. Daniel, my husband, in bed. Not alone. Maria was beside him, her dark hair spread across the pillow, her face turned toward him with an intimacy I couldn't mistake. Their bodies tangled together in betrayal, in a cruel confirmation of the doubt I had tried so hard to bury. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt hollow, as if my heart had been scooped out. I stumbled back, pressing a hand to my mouth, afraid the sob that clawed its way up would escape. Neither of them noticed me. They were lost in each other. I closed the door quietly, my body trembling. My mind screamed, my heart bled, but no tears came. Not yet. Instead, a strange calm washed over me, cold and sharp. The world had given me my sight back. And the first thing I truly saw was betrayal. But I wouldn't confront them. Not yet. Because in that moment, I knew, I would have my revenge. It wasn't going to be loud or reckless. I wasn't going to scream or cry in front of them. They had stolen something from me, and I would take something back. Slowly, carefully, perfectly. The next morning, I acted normal. I greeted Daniel with a soft smile, thanked Maria for making breakfast, and pretended nothing had changed. Inside, though, I was already planning. Every detail, every step, every move I would make to turn their world upside down without them even seeing it coming. I started paying more attention, quietly watching them both. Every stolen glance, every unnecessary touch, every excuse Daniel made. They thought they were clever. They thought I was blind, even now, because they underestimated me. But I saw everything. At night, when Daniel slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, mapping out my plan. It wasn't enough to expose them. No, I wanted them to feel what I felt. I wanted them to live with the weight of fear, the dread of being caught, the despair of losing everything they thought they had. And I knew exactly how to do it. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about power. For years, I had been vulnerable, dependent, fragile in their eyes. But now, I had my strength back. I had my vision. And I would use it to show them that the woman they thought was weak was capable of far more than they imagined. The story of how I executed my plan is not simple. It was not born in a day or carried out in a single move. It was a series of choices, subtle and deliberate, each one designed to bring me closer to the moment when they would both understand what it felt like to be deceived, broken, and left in the dark. I didn't rush. I let them believe I was still the same woman, still unaware, still trusting. That was the beauty of it. The calm before the storm. And while they continued their affair behind closed doors, I sharpened my resolve. The day I regained my sight was the day I saw the truth of my marriage. And from that day forward, I began weaving the threads of the perfect revenge. But that is only the beginning. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I carried the weight of betrayal in silence, my heart screaming while my face stayed calm. Daniel and Maria thought they were fooling me, but every whispered conversation, every subtle glance, and every time he lingered in the kitchen with her just a little too long, it all painted a picture I could no longer ignore. I began to watch them with a different set of eyes. Not the naive woman who once believed her husband's every word, but a woman reborn through pain, sharpened by betrayal. I noticed details I had once overlooked, the way Maria's lips curved when Daniel walked into the room, the shift in his voice when he spoke to her, softer, warmer than when he spoke to me. And when their hands brushed while passing dishes, they pulled away too quickly, thinking I wouldn't notice. But I did. Every observation was fuel. Not for confrontation. Not yet. But for the plan forming inside me. I told myself I couldn't act out of blind anger. That would only make me the victim once again. Instead, I needed control. My revenge had to be quiet, calculated, something that unfolded slowly until they couldn't escape the trap I was weaving. The first step was to play the role they expected me to play. I smiled at Daniel when he came home late, even kissed him on the cheek. I thanked Maria for her help, even when the sound of her voice made bile rise in my throat. I wanted them comfortable, relaxed, certain that I was blind to what they were doing. Because the moment they thought they were safe was the moment I could truly strike. Inside, though, I was unraveling. At night, I would sit alone in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the image of them in bed together. That picture burned in my mind, carved into me so deeply I doubted it would ever fade. My chest ached with a mix of anger and grief. But beneath it all, a strange power grew. The betrayal had broken something inside me, but it had also built something new, a resolve I didn't know I had. I began with small tests. One evening, I pretended to misplace a necklace that Daniel had given me years ago. I searched the living room, making just enough noise for Maria to notice. She asked what I was looking for, and I told her, watching her face closely. Her expression flickered, only for a second, but I saw it, a trace of guilt, as though she thought I knew something I shouldn't. I smiled at her, a soft, harmless smile, and told her not to worry, that I'd find it eventually. She nodded, but her hands fidgeted nervously with the dish towel. The first crack had appeared. Daniel was harder. He was careful, almost too careful, as though he knew how fragile my trust could be. But there were moments when his mask slipped. Once, when I hugged him. Unexpectedly, I caught a whiff of perfume, not mine, not one I owned. Another time, when I asked about his day, he hesitated too long before answering, as though he needed to rewrite his story in his head before speaking. Each hesitation was another thread in the web I was spinning. Meanwhile, I began to reclaim my independence. For years, I had relied on others, especially Maria, for simple things. But now, I insisted on doing them myself. I went shopping alone, cooked dinner, even cleaned the house. At first, Maria tried to protest, reminding me that was her job. I insisted anyway, smiling sweetly while I stripped her of every excuse to linger in my home. The more I pushed her out, the more uncomfortable she became. Daniel didn't question it much. Perhaps he thought it was part of my healing process, my way of adjusting to a world I could finally see again. And maybe part of it was. But mostly, it was about taking control back, piece by piece. Every task I reclaimed was another reminder that I was no longer helpless, no longer the woman they thought they could deceive so easily. One night, I overheard them talking in hushed tones in the kitchen. I stood quietly in the hallway, my breath shallow, straining to catch every word. Daniel told her to be patient, that everything would fall into place soon. Maria asked him when, her voice soft but urgent. He didn't answer right away. I closed my eyes, my nails digging into my palms as I held back the urge to storm in and scream. Instead, I walked back to the bedroom, my steps silent. Let them believe I hadn't heard a thing. That conversation was all the confirmation I needed. My plan had to be more than just exposing them. I didn't want to simply catch them and end it. No. That would be too easy. They would cry, apologize, and maybe even move on together without me. That wasn't enough. I wanted them to feel the weight of their choices, to know what it was like to have the ground ripped out from beneath them. And I knew exactly how to make that happen. It started with money. Daniel had always managed our finances. He assumed I wasn't interested, that I couldn't possibly understand the numbers he spent hours poring over. But now, with my sight restored, I began looking at everything. Bank statements, bills, investments, slowly, quietly, I learned. I opened my own accounts, moving small amounts of money he wouldn't notice, building a safety net for myself. If he thought I was dependent on him, he was wrong. At the same time, I strengthened my relationships outside the home. Friends I hadn't seen in years suddenly heard from me again. I rekindled connections, rebuilt bridges, made sure I wasn't isolated. Because when the time came, I needed people in my corner, people who would believe my story without question. Isolation had been my weakness before. I refused to let it be again. As weeks passed, I grew bolder. I began dropping subtle hints in conversation, just enough to make them uneasy. Once, while setting the table, I mentioned how grateful I was for loyalty in a marriage, how it was the foundation of trust. Maria's hand froze midair, and Daniel coughed awkwardly before changing the subject. I smiled to myself, knowing my words had landed exactly where I wanted. Another time, I asked Maria if she believed secrets always came to light eventually. She looked at me sharply, her eyes searching mine as if trying to figure out how much I knew. I gave her nothing but a calm, steady gaze, then turned away, leaving her unsettled. Daniel was harder to shake, but I found ways. When he came home late, I no longer asked questions. Instead, I simply looked at him for a moment too long, my silence louder than any accusation. It unnerved him. I could see it in the way he shifted, the way he avoided my eyes. He was beginning to sense that the woman he thought was blind, both literally and figuratively, was not so blind anymore. The power shift was slow, but it was happening. They didn't see it, not fully, but I could feel it. Every day, I grew stronger, more certain, more dangerous. And yet, I kept my mask firmly in place. Sweet smiles, polite words, the image of the forgiving wife and the grateful employer. But beneath the surface, I was preparing the storm. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I questioned myself. Was I becoming someone unrecognizable? Revenge can consume a person, twist them into something dark. But then I would remember the image of them together, the lies, the betrayal, the years of my trust they had thrown away. And I knew, I wasn't the one who created this side of me. They had. I was only answering in the language they had chosen. One evening, Daniel surprised me with flowers, as though trying to remind me of the man I once loved. I thanked him, kissed his cheek, and placed the bouquet in a vase. But as I arranged the flowers, I caught Maria watching us from the hallway, her eyes tight with jealousy. It was then I realized another truth: Maria wanted more than just an affair. She wanted him for herself. And that, I decided, would be her undoing. The trap was nearly ready. All I had to do was wait for the perfect moment, the perfect crack in their carefully constructed facade. I didn't know when it would come, but I was patient. Every day brought me closer. Every smile, every casual word, every seemingly harmless action, it was all part of the game. And the beauty of it was, they didn't even realize they were already playing. The day I regained my sight was the day I stopped being blind to the truth. But the day I truly opened my eyes, the day they would too, was still to come. And when it did, neither of them would ever forget it. The silence in our home had changed. On the surface, everything looked normal. Dinner was served, laughter was shared, and routines carried on like they always had. But underneath, a quiet tension ran through every room, invisible yet thick enough to taste. They didn't know it, but I was the one creating it. Every word I spoke, every glance I gave, every pause in a conversation, it was all deliberate. And they were falling into it without realizing. Daniel still played the part of the loving husband. He kissed me goodbye in the mornings, sent me messages during the day, and told me he missed me when he came home late. But now I knew every word was hollow, every gesture a mask. Maria still smiled, still called me ma'am, still pretended to serve me faithfully. But her eyes told a different story, restless, guilty, and increasingly wary of me. I had become a mirror they couldn't bear to look into, because they feared what reflection they might see. I spent my days preparing, though not in obvious ways. I went to the gym under the excuse of rebuilding strength after surgery. I joined a local art class, telling Daniel I wanted to experience life visually again. Both were true, but they were also part of something bigger. The gym gave me focus, discipline, and control over my body. The art class gave me the perfect cover for afternoons away from the house, time I used to quietly build the foundations of my plan. I started keeping a journal, not of my thoughts, but of their actions. Times, dates, patterns. The nights Daniel claimed to work late, the afternoons Maria lingered too long in the laundry room, the subtle signs of their coordination. On paper, it all began to take shape. Their affair wasn't just a betrayal, it was a routine. And routines could be manipulated. One evening, I tested Daniel again. As he sat across from me at dinner, I asked him casually about the new intern at his office. His fork paused midair, only for a split second, but it was enough. He forced a smile and told me she was doing fine. I nodded, pretending to accept his answer, but inside, I laughed. He was beginning to suspect I saw more than I let on. The unease in his eyes told me so. Maria, on the other hand, was unraveling faster. I could sense her nerves fraying each time I stood too close or asked too many questions. Once, I asked her to describe the colors of a dress I had bought before losing my sight. She stumbled, her words fumbling as though she didn't trust her own description. I watched her carefully, offering no hint of suspicion, only a soft thank you when she finished. But her hands shook when she poured me tea that evening. She was cracking. What neither of them knew was that I had already started weaving others into my silent war. I invited my closest friend, Claire, back into my life. She had been distant during the years of my blindness, but her warmth returned quickly when I reached out. I told her about regaining my sight, about how overwhelming it was to see again. What I didn't tell her was the full truth, not yet. But I planted seeds. Seeds of concern about Daniel's long hours, about Maria's strange closeness. I let her draw her own conclusions, her own suspicions. I needed her ready when the time came. At night, I lay awake beside Daniel, listening to his steady breathing. Sometimes, I wondered if he even realized how far he had drifted. Did he think of her while I was next to him? Did he compare us, weigh us against each other in the quiet of his mind? I would study the curve of his face in the dim light, searching for answers that never came. My heart ached, not just from anger, but from the ghost of the love I once felt for him. That ghost haunted me, whispering memories of the man who once promised to be my world. It made my resolve waver at times. But then I remembered Maria's face beside him, her smile pressed against his skin, and the ghost vanished. All that remained was determination. The first step of real action came quietly. One afternoon, while Daniel was at work and Maria was out running errands, I slipped into the study. I knew his passwords, he had been careless enough to let me overhear once. I opened his laptop, my hands trembling, and began to search. Emails, messages, photos. I found what I expected, though it still stung. Hidden folders, secret accounts. Their communication was there, masked behind codes only they thought they understood. But I understood enough. Enough to screenshot, to save, to store in a hidden drive. Evidence. Cold, undeniable evidence. My hands shook as I closed the laptop. My chest was heavy, but my mind was sharp. I wasn't ready to use the evidence yet, but having it was power. And power was something I had long been denied. When Maria returned that day, she found me humming in the kitchen, stirring soup. She smiled, but her eyes darted toward the study door as if she sensed something. I caught her glance, met her eyes, and held them just a moment too long. She looked away first. That small victory filled me with a quiet satisfaction. Over the following weeks, I continued to collect. Not just evidence, but moments, small ways of shifting control back to myself. I began locking the bedroom door at night, telling Daniel it was because I felt vulnerable after the surgery. He didn't argue, but I saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes. I told Maria I preferred to handle certain chores myself, gradually reducing her presence in spaces that once felt like hers. She nodded politely, but her smile was thinner each time. Slowly, I was erasing her place in my home. Still, I didn't act. Timing was everything. Too soon, and they would fight back. Too late, and they might slip away from me. I wanted the moment of revelation to hit them when they least expected it, when they were most comfortable. I wanted their world to collapse just as mine had, in one shattering instant. There were nights when I doubted myself. I would sit in the living room with a glass of wine, staring at the flicker of candlelight, and wonder if revenge would truly heal me. Part of me longed to confront Daniel, to scream, to demand answers. But another part knew answers wouldn't change the truth. His betrayal wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness, it was a choice. And choices had consequences. Maria, too, had made her choice. She had stepped into my life, into my home, and into my marriage without hesitation. She had smiled at me while stealing from me in the most personal way possible. That smile haunted me more than Daniel's lies. Perhaps because I had trusted her like a sister, like a friend. And she had used that trust as a weapon. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My revenge wasn't just about punishing them. It was about reclaiming myself. For years, I had been defined by blindness, by weakness, by reliance on others. They had counted on that. But now, I was no longer blind, no longer weak. My revenge was proof that I had risen from the ashes they left me in. One late afternoon, I sat in the garden, sketching the flowers with a notebook from my art class. Daniel came outside, sitting beside me, and placed his hand gently over mine. "You're amazing," he whispered. His words might have once melted me, but now they rang hollow. I looked at him, really looked, and realized something. He didn't know me anymore. He didn't see the storm building behind my eyes. He still thought of me as the woman who needed him. That was his biggest mistake. Maria brought us tea a few minutes later. She smiled politely, but her gaze lingered on Daniel, soft and yearning. I caught it instantly, though Daniel pretended not to notice. My lips curved into the faintest smile, because I realized the cracks in their illusion were widening. Desire was messy. Secrets were messy. And sooner or later, they would stumble. I just had to be ready when they did. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, I felt a calm settle over me. Not the calm of peace, but the calm before impact. I was closer than ever. My plan was no longer just an idea, it was alive, breathing, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I would be patient. Because patience was my greatest weapon now. They thought they were winning. They thought I was still blind. But the day they realized the truth, the day my mask finally dropped, would be the day their world burned. The days began to move in a quiet rhythm that almost felt deceptive, as if nothing had changed, as if the air inside the house wasn't heavy with secrets that refused to leave. Yet beneath the surface, everything was shifting. She had stopped confronting Daniel directly, had stopped asking him why he did it or why he thought she would never find out. Silence had become her most powerful tool, and in that silence, she began to rebuild a sense of power she thought she had lost forever. Maria continued working in the house as if she didn't know anything either, but the wife noticed her steps were less steady, her laughter more forced, and her eyes darting nervously whenever they crossed paths. There was no longer the same confidence, the same careless ease in the way she used to move through the rooms. The wife watched quietly, storing every detail inside her mind like pieces of a puzzle she knew. She would complete at the right time. Daniel, on the other hand, pretended harder than both of them. He acted like nothing had ever happened, as though they were still the couple they once were, the couple that had faced blindness together, the couple who had promised each other everything. He smiled more than usual, brought flowers, tried to hold her hand more often, but every touch now felt staged, every smile rehearsed. She knew he was afraid of what she might do, and that fear became her strength. She started to change in small ways, ways Daniel noticed but could never question. She dressed differently, carried herself differently, and her eyes now held a calmness that made him uneasy. She didn't raise her voice, didn't cry, didn't accuse. Instead, she spoke softly, kindly even, which unsettled him more than anger ever could. Because anger is predictable, but kindness after betrayal is unpredictable and dangerous. Late at night, when Daniel thought she was asleep, she would feel him restless beside her. His body would shift again and again, his breathing uneven, and she could almost hear his thoughts spinning in the darkness. The guilt was eating him slowly, and he couldn't hide it. He was no longer the man who had once betrayed her so easily, he was now the man trapped in the shadow of his own mistake. One afternoon, she called Maria into the kitchen. The younger woman froze for a moment, but obeyed. The wife didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke gently, asked about her family, her plans, her dreams. Maria's answers were shaky, and her hands fumbled with the edge of her apron. And then, without warning, the wife smiled, a smile that wasn't cruel, but wasn't forgiving either. It was a smile Maria couldn't read, and that made it more terrifying than any harsh word could have been. Maria left the kitchen with trembling hands, her confidence breaking piece by piece. The wife knew then that she didn't need to scream or fight to reclaim her dignity. She only needed patience. She only needed time. Every day that passed, the silence between them grew heavier, pressing on Daniel and Maria like an invisible weight. She carried herself like a woman who knew more than she let on, and in that subtle power, she saw both of them shrinking. Her plan was never about loud revenge. It wasn't about exposing them to the world or destroying them with dramatic scenes. No, her plan was quieter, deeper. She wanted them to live with the fear of not knowing what she would do. She wanted them to feel the same helplessness she had felt when she realized what they had stolen from her trust. She didn't need to strike quickly. She only needed to let the fear of her presence, the quietness of her watchful eyes, and the weight of her knowledge crush them from within. Daniel grew thinner. His laughter became shorter, his words more careful. He stopped making jokes at the dinner table, stopped leaving his phone carelessly on the counter. He was always on edge, waiting, watching her, wondering when she would finally explode. But she never did. And that waiting became his prison. Maria, once so bold, began asking for days off more often. She moved nervously around the house, and sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, she wiped tears from her eyes. The wife saw it all, and though part of her heart ached with the familiar pull of compassion, she reminded herself of the nights she had cried alone, of the way her world had shattered the moment her eyes were healed and she saw what she was never meant to see. And yet, in the middle of all this, something unexpected began to happen. The wife felt herself growing lighter. Not because she forgave them, not because she forgot, but because she realized she no longer needed them to give her closure. She was creating her own closure, step by step, by holding her silence like a weapon and watching it carve its way through their guilt. She didn't need to shout the truth. She didn't need the world to know. The truth was enough to break them, and she carried that truth with grace. One evening, Daniel broke. He stood in front of her, his hands trembling, his eyes red, and finally whispered what he had never dared to say out loud. He begged for forgiveness, promised it was over, swore he would spend his life making it right. But she didn't answer. She only looked at him with eyes that had once been blind but now saw everything clearly. That silence was more painful than any rejection, because it meant she held all the power now, and he had nothing left to offer that could erase what he had done. The days continued like this, and she could feel the balance shifting entirely in her favor. Maria's days in the house were numbered, and Daniel was now a shadow of the man he once was. The wife no longer felt weak, no longer felt broken. Instead, she felt like a woman who had been through fire and had come out stronger, sharper, unshakable. And though the story hadn't yet reached its final chapter, she knew it was heading there. Slowly, naturally, not rushed. Every day brought her closer to the moment when she would decide what the ending would look like. Would she walk away from him, leaving him in the ruins of his own choices? Would she let him stay, but never again touch the depths of her heart? Or would she take a path neither of them expected, one that would leave its mark on them forever? For now, she didn't decide. She let the days stretch quietly, let the silence remain her greatest shield, and allowed herself the rare gift of watching two guilty hearts unravel themselves without her having to lift a finger. The story hadn't ended yet, but it was no longer hers to carry as a burden. It was theirs to suffer, theirs to crumble under, and hers to rise above. And in that rising, she felt free for the first time in a long, long while.